Aaron Scott was supposed to preach today, and at about 9:30, I got a text message that Aaron was sick. Aaron emailed me his sermon, and I don't typically preach other people's sermons, but at about 9:40, I read Aaron's sermon and decided that it needed to be preached. So, I am preaching Aaron's sermon today, and when I say I, you should imagine Aaron. I, Aaron, have been in conversation with her, that's me, and with some other folks here at Christ Church, both long-timers and newbies like myself, over the last months about starting up a new ministry of community meals here at Christ Church. To be clear, Christ Church already feeds people, literally in many ways, and will continue to do all of that. What we have been discussing recently with the outreach leadership team is how might Christ Church build new and stronger relationships with people in this neighborhood from all walks of life through the ministry of sitting down and eating together. Part of how we discern calls to try a new ministry together is to get serious in our thinking about it, not just figuring out the logistics of it, or who's going to play which role, or what kind of training and preparation we need, or how we are going to pay for the food, all of which we do need to figure out together. Stay tuned for those conversations. But the kind of thinking I'm talking about here is, what does Jesus fundamentally teach about doing ministry? How might we apply his teaching in our neighborhood, here and now? The gospel reading today is about Jesus' model of ministry. If I had to boil down that model to just 3 points, I would say, 1, Jesus' ministry is not about fixing people. Not blind people, not disabled people, not poor people, not anyone who's being left out. 2, Jesus' ministry is not a set of magic tricks from a lone magic man. It is a powerful, community-wide effort that we are meant, as his followers, to emulate by tending people in body and mind and spirit. 3, Jesus' ministry is political because it makes clear that empire is not our only option for how we behave in relationship with one another. So let me say again clearly before I say anything else. This reading is not about Jesus fixing people with disabilities. People who are blind are whole people and do not need to be fixed. This seems to be a hard sell for Christians, both because there are so many stories about Jesus' specific ministry with blind people in the Gospels, and also because our contemporary society still hasn't shaken this deep stigma around disability that we read about in John. I was in a meeting with New Testament scholar Richard A. Horsley several years ago. He was one of only a handful of academics in the room. The rest of us were organizers. Richard Horsley had been invited to talk about his work on the historical Jesus and the Jesus movement's relevance to those of us working on the ground in communities hard hit by poverty and injustice. In talking specifically about the stories of Jesus restoring people's sight and other miracle healing stories, Horsley told us, as best as a lot of us scholars can tell today, what we think was going on here was really just some form of rudimentary health care He said this a little bit braced, like he was worried about how we would respond, like maybe he felt bad about stealing the magic from us, as if Jesus were just Santa Claus. But the room caught fire when he said this. Why? Because basic health care was one of the central struggles of most of the people and communities represented in the room. Saying it's just health care was like saying it's just housing or it's just food. It's not just health care if you have buried your child due to your state's denial of Medicaid expansion. It's not just health care if you are living in a tent because you're forced to choose between paying for heart medication or rent. It's not just health care when you know your nation will or is spending billions of dollars in a matter of days to go to war, but somehow you're working 3 gig jobs and still drowning in medical debt. From there, we went on in this meeting to study together the context in which Jesus' miracle ministries take place. On the healthcare front, people pointed to other stories where it was made clear there was indeed an expensive healthcare economy of some kind in place. In Jesus' healing of the hemorrhaging woman, the Bible plainly tells us she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all the money she had. Connecting to the struggle of labor justice, we looked at the conditions of exploitation faced by first-century fishermen in Galilee and asked why they might be so ready to walk off the job when Jesus called them to follow. With regard to feeding people, we looked at the meaning of community-led efforts to thousands of people with loaves and fishes in a society where the overwhelming majority of people under Roman occupation faced severe food insecurity. In Roman society, just as the overwhelming majority of people did not have enough food, historians now imagine that nearly everyone was living with some form of disability or impairment, whether due to injury, infection, malnutrition, or otherwise. Having organized in poor communities for 20 years myself, I can confirm that rates of disability are astronomically higher among people who do not have adequate access to food, to housing, and to health care. So from this vantage point, the way I understand Jesus' healing miracles are the same way I understand Jesus' feeding miracles. The Jesus movement is organizing interventions directly addressing the material needs of mass numbers of people who have been left out in a profoundly unequal society, a society that has the ability to feed and provide care for them, but refuses to do so. What an embarrassment and what a crisis it presents for the Roman authorities, who claim to be so much more powerful and intelligent and moral than their subjugated conquests. That this ragtag movement of the poor is doing a better job at solving their own problems than is the empire. No wonder a blind man's parents don't want to make a statement to the Pharisees about what Jesus did. The temple authorities report to Herod, who reports to the emperor, and nobody wants to be the one to tell the emperor he has no clothes. We might think, well, it can't just be that this person was healed of a bad infection in his eyes. The text says he was born blind. Indeed, of the 8 gospel stories we have on Jesus providing health care to blind people, only today's identifies anyone as blind from birth. But we have to remember that this is the Gospel of John, which has a certain bravado that is always going to lift a story from Mark or Matthew and escalate it to give Jesus more power. But these healing stories are not about magic tricks. They are revolutionary stories of collective care and survival, of the Jesus movement building networks of resilience and power and love among the poor in the ancient world. These stories are also not charity stories. Extensive charity existed under Roman rule as a means of staving off rebellion. Charity done in this way was not about providing material assistance, it's about control. The way Jesus models ministry for us here could not be more opposite. Roman relief programs hinged on sacking and subduing colonial territories, then shipping grain extorted there to feed those who the empire deemed the more deserving poor, citizens. This may sound familiar to us. Contrast this to Jesus' feeding miracles. Who among the multitude gets fed? Everyone. Nobody is asked to prove their citizenship or their income. And who does the feeding? Is it Jesus? On a pedestal all by himself like Caesar? No. He says to the disciples, "You give them something to eat." And when they can't figure it out, they call an even more bit player into leadership, the kid with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, to help solve the problems of the community. Teaching all the while, further developing the crowd, not as helpless charity cases, but as people whose bodies and minds and souls deserve dignity. This is our template for ministry. And this template echoes again in today's gospel reading. Really, it echoes across our readings. In the man who was born blind, we find a beautiful and overlooked leader, overlooked by his neighbors and by the Pharisees, just as David is overlooked in Samuel, but found beautiful by Jesus for his refusal to back down from the truth of what he experienced. The story doesn't end with his restoration of sight. He is interrogated. His parents are interrogated. He stands up for himself when Jesus goes and finds him and says, he stands up for himself to the point of being driven out, and that is when Jesus goes to find him and says to the Pharisees, "This man is not the problem. The system you prop up by scapegoating people at the bottom while the folks on the top are hurting us, that is the problem. He and his family are not sinful. The system is." I want to close with a story about a small, struggling Episcopal congregation from several decades ago. St. Augustine's in Oakland, California, because I think it brings to life this model of ministry when Jesus and the temple can seem like a universe long ago and far away. Reverend Earl Neal, who passed away 2 years ago, was the priest at St. Augustine's, and he had made his way to Oakland after helping organize the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery. At St. Augustine's in January of 1969, Reverend Neal began working with members of the parish and young organizers in the neighborhood to address hunger issues. Under the leadership of a parishioner named Ruth Beckford Smith, they set up the Free Breakfast for School Children program in the parish hall of St. Augustine's. On the first day, they fed and taught and cared for 11 children. By the end of the first week, they were serving 135 children a day. 2 months later, they had to open a second site at another church. By the end of 1969, the program had fed 20,000 children. By 1971, it was operating at 36 sites across the nation. I didn't know this part, friends. Those young organizers in the neighborhood were members of the Black Panther Party. No idea. And even as their organization was brutally repressed by the FBI, the Free Breakfast for School Children program was so popular and effective across lines of race that it forced the U.S. government to step up and permanently authorize free breakfast programs across the U.S. school system by 1975, 6 years. Something that likely would never have happened otherwise. We probably have a mental image that pops into our minds when we hear the name Black Panther Party. But I wonder if that image includes, for most of us, Reverend Earl Neal and Miss Ruth Beckford Smith, St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, and those first 11 kids. This wide range of personalities, undoubtedly imperfect and at odds sometimes, but who still came together, show us three things. Ministry is not about fixing people, not blind people, not disabled people, not poor people, not anyone who is being left out. Ministry is not a magic trick. It is a powerful, community-wide effort that we are meant, as Jesus followers, to emulate by tending people in body and mind and in spirit. Ministry is political because it makes clear that empire is not our only option for how we behave in relationship to one another. Amen.